In the autumn of 1879, in a forgotten Montana town, a father looked his daughter in the face and spoke the cruelest words a child can hear. "You'll never be loved, you're too plain, too stubborn, too much trouble for any man." 3 days later, he handed her over to a scarred, one-eyed rancher in exchange for 2 months' worth of whiskey and a wagon repair. But what that bitter father never imagined was that the man the town called broken would see his daughter as the most precious thing he'd ever held. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The air in Copper Falls tasted of dust and disappointment that October morning. Main Street stretched narrow and crooked between weathered storefronts, their paint peeling like old skin, their windows filmed with years of neglect. At the far end, where the road dissolved into prairie, grass and empty sky, the blacksmith's forge sent up lazy spirals of smoke that hung in the still air like ghosts refusing to leave. Clara Whitmore stood in the doorway of Brennan's tavern, a wooden bucket heavy in her hands, watching the water inside tremble with each breath she took. 21 years old, tall and lean as a fence post, with dark hair she kept tied back in a braid that reached her waist. She had her mother's sharp cheekbones and her father's unfortunate talent for silence. The women in town called her plain. The men called her difficult. Her father called her a burden he'd carried too long. Inside, Henry Whitmore sat at his usual corner table, 3 empty bottles lined up like soldiers at attention, a 4th halfway to joining them. His face had gone red and swollen over the years, his hands shook unless they held glass, and his eyes, once the clear blue of mountain lakes, had turned the color of old ice, clouded and distant. "Clara," he barked, not looking up. "Get in here." She set the bucket down carefully, though part of her wanted to let it drop, wanted to hear the crash and splash, wanted something in this town to break as loudly as she felt broken inside. But she'd learned long ago that wanting changed nothing. She stepped inside. The tavern smelled of sour beer, unwashed men, and the particular staleness that clings to places where hope goes to die. A handful of drifters hunched over their drinks. Old Moses, the town drunk, who somehow still managed to outlast her father in sobriety, dozed against the back wall. Behind the bar, Brennan himself, thick-armed, thick-necked, with eyes that saw everything and forgave nothing, wiped the same glass he'd been wiping for what looked like an hour. "Sit," her father said. Clara remained standing. Henry finally looked up, and something in his expression made her stomach turn cold. She'd seen him angry before, seen him mean, seen him cruel in the casual way of men who've given up fighting their own demons and decided to make war on everyone else instead. But this was different. This was a calculation. "Man's coming to meet you," he said, words sliding together like oil on water. "Samuel Kane runs the double C spread up past Widow's Ridge. Lost his eye in the war, looks like hell, but he's got land, got cattle, got a house that needs tending." Clara's throat tightened. "Why would I meet him?" "Because I arranged it." Henry's smile was a slash across his ruined face. "He needs help. Lord knows I need." He trailed off, lifted the bottle, drank deep. "I'm not a hired girl," Clara said carefully. "No." Her father set the bottle down with a thunk that echoed through the tavern. "You're not. You're a daughter nobody wants, too old to marry, too stubborn to be useful, taking up space and eating food I can't afford. Kane's willing to take you off my hands. In exchange, my debts here get settled. I get enough to see me through winter, and you get a roof that ain't leaking and food that ain't scraps." The words landed like physical blows. Clara felt her vision narrow, felt the room tilt slightly to the left. "You're selling me." "I'm making an arrangement," Henry corrected, his voice hardening. "You think you got better prospects? You think some young man's gonna come riding through here, see you hauling slop buckets and mending my shirts, and decide you're the woman he's been dreaming of?" He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You'll never be loved, girl. Not the way you are. Might as well be useful." Brennan stopped wiping the glass. Old Moses stirred in his sleep. Even the drifters had gone quiet, watching this private destruction made public. Clara stood very still, her hands clenched at her sides, so tight her knuckles went white. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. She wanted to tell her father exactly what kind of man he'd become, wanted to list every cruelty, every failure, every moment he'd chosen liquor over his own child. But the words stuck in her throat, hard and sharp as swallowed glass, because beneath the rage, beneath the humiliation, lay a terrible truth. Where else could she go? She had no money, no family besides this wreck of a man who'd just bartered her like livestock, no skills beyond cooking and mending, and the kind of hard labor that broke backs without building futures. The women in town already whispered about her, too old, too odd, too separate from their careful world of quilting circles and church socials. And the men looked past her the way people look past fence posts, noticing only when one needs replacing. "He'll be here within the hour," Henry said, already reaching for the bottle again. "You'll go with him today." Brennan's got the papers drawn up. "Papers," Clara repeated, the word foreign in her mouth. "Makes it legal-like," Brennan said from behind the bar, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You ain't a slave, Miss Clara. Papers say you're going as housekeeper, with wages held in trust. After a year, you're free to leave if you want." "If she lasts a year," Henry laughed again. "Cain's a hard man. War did something to him, beyond taking his eye. Lives alone out there except for his boys, 4 of them, wild as mustangs. Place is half falling down. He's been through 3 housekeepers in 2 years. He leaned back, studying his daughter with a cold assessment. "But you're tough, I'll give you that. Tough and too stubborn to quit. Maybe that's worth something after all." Clara felt herself splitting in two, one part still standing in this tavern, numb and silent, while another part floated somewhere above. Watching this scene like it was happening to someone else, this couldn't be her life. This couldn't be the sum total of 21 years of breathing and working and trying so hard to be good, to be useful, to be enough. Her mother had died when Clara was 12, a fever that took her in 3 days flat, leaving nothing behind but a silver locket and the lingering scent of lavender that faded from the house within a week. Her father had loved her mother. Clara remembered that love, fierce and tender and real. But when she died, something in Henry died too, and what remained had turned bitter and mean, pickled in whiskey and regret. "I'll get my things," Clara said quietly. "Ain't much point," Henry replied. "Cain said he'd provide what you need. Just take what matters." "What matters?" Clara almost laughed. What mattered could fit in a handkerchief. The locket, a small book of poems her mother used to read aloud, a packet of letters from an aunt who died 3 years back. Everything else was just cloth and leather, objects to fill the space between waking and sleeping. She walked out of the tavern without another word, her father's voice following her. "Don't make me regret this more than I already do." Outside, the sun had climbed higher, turning the dust in the street to gold. Clara stood on the wooden sidewalk, breathing carefully, counting her heartbeats because it was something to count, something to measure, proof that she was still alive despite feeling hollowed out and empty. A woman emerged from the general store across the street, Mrs. Landry, the banker's wife, dressed in purple silk that must have cost more than Clara's father made in a year. She took one look at Clara, then quickly looked away, hurrying down the sidewalk like proximity to disaster might be contagious. Clara watched her go and felt nothing. That was the worst part. Not rage anymore, just a vast emptiness where feelings should be. She returned to the room she rented above the milliner's shop, a space barely large enough for a narrow bed, a trunk, and a wash basin. The window overlooked the alley where cats fought and drunks slept off their binges. She'd lived here since her father sold their house 2 years ago, back when his drinking finally cost him his job at the lumber mill. She gathered her few possessions: the locket, the book, the letters, a change of clothes, a hairbrush her mother had given her, a small sewing kit, everything fit in a canvas bag that had once held flour. She was tying the bag closed when she heard hoofbeats in the street below. Clara moved to the window and looked down. A man was dismounting from a tall roan horse, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body had learned pain and didn't forget it. He wore dark trousers, a plain shirt, a vest that had seen better days, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. When he turned to tie the horse to the rail, Clara caught her first clear view of his face. The left side was unmarred, strong jaw, straight nose, the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years of sun and wind, but the right side told a different story. A scar ran from his temple down across his cheek, puckering the skin, and where his right eye should have been was simply absence, the lid sealed shut in a permanent wink that suggested violence rather than humor. Samuel Cain. Had to be. He didn't look toward her window, didn't seem to notice much of anything except the tavern door he was walking toward. But there was something in the set of his shoulders, the straightness of his spine despite the limp in his left leg, that spoke of dignity maintained against considerable odds. Clara stepped back from the window, heart hammering. This was real now. This was happening. She descended the narrow stairs, bag in hand, and stepped out into the street just as her father emerged from the tavern with Samuel Cain beside him. Up close, the rancher was taller than she'd thought, broader through the shoulders, his remaining eye the color of slate after rain. That eye found her and held steady, assessing but not unkind. "This is Clara," Henry said, his words still slurred, but his tone artificially bright, like he was introducing them at a church social instead of selling his daughter to pay his bar tab. Samuel Cain removed his hat, a gesture so unexpected and courtly that Clara blinked. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rolling in a river. "I understand your father's told you about the arrangement." "He mentioned it," Clara said carefully. "It's honest work," Samuel continued, still holding her gaze with that single eye. "4 boys need tending, house needs managing, cooking, mending, the usual. Pays fair $20 a month, held in account at the bank in your name. You're free to leave after a year if the situation don't suit." $20 a month. More than she'd ever had in her life. More than her father had seen in months, probably years. "And if it doesn't suit before a year?" she asked. Something shifted in Samuel's expression, not quite a smile, but a softening around the edges. "Then you leave, before a year." "I'm not in the business of keeping people against their will, Miss Whitmore." Henry made an impatient noise. "It'll suit fine. Clara's a hard worker, always has been. She'll earn her. Keep." Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch, heavy with the clink of coins. He handed it to Brennan, who'd followed them out of the tavern. "This squares his debts." "And then some," Brennan confirmed, weighing the pouch in his palm. "Good." Samuel turned back to Henry, and now his voice had ice in it. "Then we're done here. The debt's paid. You don't come around the double C, you don't ask for more, you don't bother your daughter. Are we clear?" Henry bristled. "She's still my—" "Are we clear?" Samuel repeated, and though he didn't raise his voice, something in it made Henry step back. "Clear," her father muttered. Samuel nodded once, then turned to Clara. "My wagon's around back. I've got supplies to load, then we'll head out. Should reach the ranch by sundown if we don't dawdle." He walked away without waiting for a response, that careful limp marking his stride, leaving Clara standing between the tavern and her father's retreating back. For a long moment she stood frozen, the weight of her canvas bag pulling at her shoulder. Then Henry turned, just for a second, and their eyes met. She waited for something, an apology, a goodbye, some scrap of the man he used to be before whiskey and grief had eaten him hollow. But he just looked at her with those clouded eyes and said, "Try not to shame me more than you already have." Then he was gone, disappearing back into the tavern's dim interior. Clara stood alone in the street, the autumn sun warm on her face, and felt the last thin thread connecting her to her old life snap clean in two. She was adrift now, unmoored. Whatever came next would be built from nothing, with no foundation but her own two hands, and the slim hope that a scarred stranger with one eye might be less cruel than the father who'd raised her. She walked around, back to where Samuel Kane was securing ropes around crates in a sturdy wagon. He glanced up when she approached, that slate eye assessing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "You ready?" he asked. Clara looked at the wagon, at the horse stamping its feet, at the road leading north out of Copper Falls toward land she'd never seen. She thought about her father's words, "You'll never be loved," and felt them settle into her bones like truth she'd always known but never spoken aloud. "I'm ready," she said. Samuel offered his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. His palm was calloused, his grip steady and respectful. He didn't hold on a second longer than necessary. She settled onto the wooden bench, bag at her feet, and watched as he climbed up beside her. He didn't speak as he released the brake and snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, wheels creaking, and Copper Falls began to slide away behind them, the tavern, the shops, the people who'd watched her grow up. Without ever really seeing her, the road north stretched empty and pale beneath an endless sky. Mountains rose in the distance like promises or threats, depending on how you chose to see them. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and coming rain, and beside her Samuel Kane sat silent, his hands steady on the reins, his scarred face turned toward home. Clara didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing. Whatever waited ahead, hardship or hope, cruelty or kindness, it couldn't possibly hurt more than what she was leaving behind. The wagon rolled on. The sun climbed higher, and somewhere in the space between 1 mile and the next, Clara Whitmore stopped being the daughter no one wanted and became something else entirely. She just didn't know what. Yet. The wagon wheels ground against stone and packed earth as they climbed higher into country Clara had never seen. For the first hour, Copper Falls remained visible behind them, a smudge of buildings growing, smaller until it disappeared entirely into the folds of the land. After that, there was only prairie, endless rolling grassland, the color of old gold, broken occasionally by stands of cottonwood, and the dark line of distant pine forests climbing the mountain slopes. Samuel Kane drove in silence, his attention fixed on the road ahead. Clara sat beside him, hands folded in her lap, watching the landscape transform. The air grew cooler as they gained elevation. Hawks circled overhead, their cries sharp and lonely. Once, a herd of antelope scattered across their path, fluid as water, disappearing into a draw before Clara could count them. She'd expected him to speak, to explain what would be expected of her, to outline rules or boundaries, but he remained quiet, seemingly content to let the miles pass unmarked by conversation. It should have been uncomfortable, but somehow it wasn't. There was nothing demanding in his silence, nothing hostile. It simply was. After 2 hours, he finally spoke. "There's a canteen under the seat. Help yourself." Clara reached down and found the metal container, still cool despite the afternoon heat. She drank carefully, the water clean and cold, tasting faintly of stone. "Thank you." He nodded once but didn't elaborate. Another mile passed before she ventured a question. "How long have you had the ranch?" 12 years, he said. "Bought it with my discharge pay after the war. Wasn't much then, just a shack and some wild land. Built it up slow. The war, Clara repeated carefully. She knew better than to pry, but curiosity won out. Which side? Union, 3rd Infantry. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Lost the eye at Stones River, lost the easy sleep everywhere else. The honesty surprised her. Men usually dressed up their war stories, made them grand and glorious. Samuel just stated facts like he was reporting the weather. "I'm sorry," she said, "don't be. Kept my life. That's more than most managed." He glanced at her. Then, that single eye, sharp and assessing. "Your father mentioned you read. That true?" "Yes." "Good. Boys need teaching, and I'm not suited for it. I can work numbers and write my name, but beyond that—" He shrugged. "Figure a woman with learning might give them a better start." Clara absorbed this. So she wasn't just a housekeeper, she was expected to be a teacher too. The thought didn't frighten her. If anything, it sparked something that might have been hope. "How old are they?" "Daniel's 15, near to 16. Luke's 12. Benjamin just turned 9, and Charlie's 6. Something in his voice softened when he mentioned the youngest. Charlie don't remember his mother. The others do, which makes it harder in different ways. "How long has she been gone?" 4 years this December. He said it without emotion, but Clara saw his grip tighten on the reins. Fever took her quick. 1 week she was fine, the next she was buried. The same way Clara's mother had died. She understood that particular species of grief, how speed made it worse somehow, gave you no time to prepare, left you holding a lifetime of unsaid words. "I won't try to replace her," Clara said quietly. "With them, I mean." Samuel's head turned sharply toward her, surprise clear on his face. "Didn't expect you to. Just need someone to keep the house from falling apart and make sure the boys don't grow up completely wild." He paused. "Your father made it sound like you'd be grateful for any roof and any table. Made you sound desperate and difficult in equal measure." Heat crept up Clara's neck. "I'm not desperate. Didn't figure you were. Desperate people don't have the kind of steel I saw in your eyes when you climbed into this wagon." He returned his attention to the road. "And difficult usually just means someone who won't be pushed around. I got no use for pushing, Miss Whitmore. Life's hard enough without adding meanness to it." Something in Clara's chest loosened, just slightly. She studied his profile, the scarred side toward her, the sealed eye, the sharp line of his jaw. The town had called him broken. Her father had spoken of him like damaged goods, someone forced to settle for cast-offs because nothing better would have him. But sitting beside him now, Clara saw none of that. She saw a man who'd survived horror and come out the other side, still standing, still decent. "You can call me Clara," she said. "Miss Whitmore sounds like someone I'm not." He considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Clara. And you can call me Samuel, or Sam if that sits easier. Only people who call me Mr. Kane are trying to sell me something or collect a debt." The corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. By late afternoon, the land began to change. The open prairie gave way to rougher country, rocky outcroppings, deeper ravines, forests of lodgepole pine. A creek appeared beside the road, running clear and cold over smooth stones. Samuel followed it. North, the wagons splashing through shallow crossings, water spraying up in silver arcs. Then, as they rounded a bend in the road, the Double C Ranch came into view. It sat in a wide valley, protected on 3 sides by rising hills dark with timber. The creek they'd been following cut through the heart of it, lined with willows and wild roses. Pastureland spread out in all directions, dotted with cattle far more than Clara had expected. Fences ran straight and true, recently mended. A barn stood solid and square, its red paint faded but intact. Beyond it a corral held several horses, their coats gleaming in the slanting light. And the house, it wasn't grand, nothing like the fine homes Clara had glimpsed in the few books she'd read about city life. But it was substantial. 2 stories, built from logs that had been carefully fitted and chinked. A wide porch wrapped around the front, its posts carved with simple designs. Shutters flanked each window, some hanging straight, others slightly askew but all present. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, meaning someone had kept the fire going. "It's bigger than I expected," Clara said, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "Had to be. 4 growing boys take up a lot of space." Samuel guided the wagon toward the barn. House is sound, roof solid, walls are tight. Inside needs work cleaning, organizing, all the things that fall apart when there's no woman's hand to manage them. Last housekeeper only lasted 3 months before she decided cattle country wasn't for her. What happened to the one before that? Got married to a merchant in Helena. And the one before her couldn't handle the boys, said they were hellions without proper discipline. He brought the wagon to a stop, which they are, truth be told. But they're my hellions. Before Clara could respond, a door slammed and voices erupted into the evening air. 4 figures spilled out of the house like water breaking through a dam. The oldest reached them, first tall and rangy, with dark hair falling into eyes, the same slate color as his father's. He pulled up short when he saw Clara, wariness replacing curiosity. "Pa, Daniel." Samuel climbed down from the wagon, then turned to offer Clara his hand. She accepted it, stepping down onto solid ground that felt strange after hours of movement. "This is Clara Whitmore. She'll be managing the house from now on." The other 3 boys had arrived by then, forming a line of varying heights and suspicion. The second tallest had lighter hair and a spattering of freckles across his nose. The third was built stockier, with a stubborn set to his jaw. And the smallest, barely reaching his father's elbow, had Samuel's face in miniature, same strong bones, same direct gaze, but with both eyes wide and curious. "Boys, this is Clara," Samuel said. "Clara, this is Daniel, Luke, Benjamin, and Charlie." Luke, the freckled one, spoke first. "What happened to Mrs. Henderson?" "She went back to her sister's place in Billings," Samuel replied. "And this time we're going to make sure things work out better. Which means you all treat Clara with respect, do as she asks, and don't give her reason to leave." Benjamin crossed his arms. "Don't need another lady telling us what to do." "Ben," Samuel's voice dropped to a tone that carried warning without being loud. "Mind your manners." The boy's jaw set harder, but he uncrossed his arms. Charlie, meanwhile, had been studying Clara with the frank intensity only children possess. "You got a pretty braid," he announced. "Ma used to braid hers too, but it was yellow, not dark." An uncomfortable silence fell. Daniel shot his youngest brother a look that could have curdled milk, but Samuel just sighed. "Charlie, why don't you show Clara inside while I tend to the horses? Rest of you, get washed up for supper." The boys dispersed with varying levels of enthusiasm. Charlie, however, stepped closer to Clara, his small face serious. "You gonna leave too?" The question hit harder than Clara expected. She crouched down so they were eye level. "I just got here, haven't even seen inside yet. But after? When you see how messy everything is?" Clara studied his anxious expression and made a decision. "I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. You help me figure out where everything goes, and I promise I won't leave without saying goodbye first. How's that?" Charlie considered this with the gravity of a judge weighing evidence. Finally, he nodded. "Deal." He held out his small hand, and they shook on it solemnly. The inside of the house matched Clara's first impressions, solid but overwhelmed. The main room served as kitchen and living space combined, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall. A long wooden table stood in the center, scarred with use, and currently buried under a chaotic collection of tools, books, rope, and what appeared to be part of a bridle. Dirty dishes were stacked haphazardly near a deep basin. Boots lay scattered across the floor like fallen soldiers. But beneath the mess, Clara could see good bones. The floorboards were wide and well fitted. The windows, though smudged, let in generous light. Shelves lined the walls, and though they were currently disorganized, they showed careful craftsmanship. Someone had built this house with care and intention. Charlie tugged her sleeve. Kitchen's this way. But we mostly just eat whatever, don't need much cooking. He led her through an archway into a smaller room where a cast-iron stove crouched against the wall like a sleeping beast. Pots and pans hung from hooks, and a workbench offered space for preparation. It was dusty and clearly underused, but functional. "Where's the water?" Clara asked. "Pumps out back. Creek water comes straight through. Pa built a system." Charlie's chest puffed with pride. "He's real good at building things." They continued the tour. A narrow staircase led to the second floor, where 4 small bedrooms opened off a central hallway. The boys' rooms were predictable disasters of rumpled blankets and scattered clothing. But at the end of the hall, a 5th room stood with its door ajar. Charlie stopped before they reached it. That was Ma's sewing room. "Pa, don't go in there much, but he said you could use it if you wanted." Clara pushed the door open carefully. The room was small, but charming, with a single window overlooking the valley. A narrow bed stood against one wall, neatly made with a faded quilt. A simple dresser waited empty. And in the corner, a rocking chair sat beside a basket filled with fabric scraps and thread. "It's perfect," Clara said softly. "Really?" Charlie sounded doubtful. "It's kind of small. Small means cozy. And that window." Clara moved to look out at the view hills, turning purple in the gathering dusk, the creek catching the last light, cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. "That window's worth more than size." By the time they returned, downstairs, the other boys had washed up, though washed seemed to be a generous interpretation. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, still watching Clara with guarded eyes. Luke had found a seat at the table, pushing aside tools to make room. Benjamin stood near the fireplace, arms crossed again, stubborn resistance radiating from every line of his body. Samuel entered through the back door, wiping his hands on his trousers. He took in the scene with a single glance. "Ben, lose the attitude or lose your supper." "I ain't got an attitude," Benjamin muttered, but he uncrossed his arms. Samuel turned to Clara. "Kitchen's a mess, I know. Boys were supposed to clean it this week, but apparently supposed to, and actually did, are different concepts." He shot a meaningful look at his sons. "There's salt pork in the cold cellar, beans in the pantry, and bread from 3 days ago that's probably still edible. I won't pretend the cupboard's well stocked. We've been making do with supplies. Running low." Clara surveyed the chaos, then rolled up her sleeves. "I'll need water heated. Someone clear that table. And I'll need to know what food is actually here versus what Samuel's hoping is here." For a moment, no one moved. Then Samuel nodded at Daniel. "You heard her. Get to it." Something shifted, then subtle but real. Daniel pushed off from the doorframe and began gathering tools from the table. Luke jumped up to help, though his idea of clearing seemed to involve shoving everything into a pile on the floor. Even Benjamin, after a long moment, stomped over to the water pump. Clara found an apron hanging on a peg, worn but clean, and tied it around her waist. She moved to the stove, assessed its temperament with an experienced eye, and began coaxing it back to life. The fire had burned down to coals, but there was enough heat to work with. Charlie appeared at her elbow. "I can help." "Then you can be my assistant," Clara said. "First job, find me every pot that's actually clean." He scurried off with the importance of someone given a mission. Samuel watched this unfold from his position near the door, his expression unreadable. Then he moved to help Daniel, and together they transformed the table from disaster to functional surface. Clara worked methodically, taking inventory of the pantry as she went, beans as promised. Flour, though it was getting low, a few potatoes sprouting in a bin, onions, some soft but salvageable. The salt pork was decent quality, if heavily salted. No eggs, no milk, no fresh vegetables. They'd been living like cowboys on a trail drive rather than a working ranch. She set beans to soak, sliced salt pork into a skillet, diced onions with quick efficiency. The scents began to fill the kitchen, meat sizzling, onions softening, wood smoke from the stove. Bread might be 3 days old, but sliced thin and toasted near the fire, it would do. The boys gradually drew closer, pulled by the smells of something better than their usual fare. Samuel moved to the basin and began washing the stack of dirty dishes without being asked, his movements efficient, despite working one-handed while the other held plates steady. "You don't have to do that," Clara said. "Neither do you, technically. But we're both here, so might as well make ourselves useful." He rinsed a plate and set it aside. "Besides, boys need to see that work doesn't have a gender. Everybody contributes." It was, Clara realized, the first time a man had done household work in her presence without complaint or self-congratulation. Her father would have sooner eaten off his hat than washed a dish. Within an hour, something resembling supper emerged from the chaos. It wasn't fancy beans cooked with salt, pork and onions, toasted bread, water from the pump, but it was hot and plentiful and tasted of care rather than mere sustenance. They sat around the table, Samuel at one end, Clara at the other, boys filling the sides. For a moment, no one spoke. They just ate with the focused intensity of people who'd been making do with not quite enough for too long. Charlie finished first, swinging his legs under the chair. "This is real good. It's just beans," Benjamin muttered, but Clara noticed he'd cleaned his plate completely. "Just beans cooked right," Luke corrected. He looked at Clara with new respect. "Mrs. Henderson mostly gave us mush, said it was easier. Easier for her, maybe," Clara replied. "But you all deserve better than mush." Daniel had been quiet throughout the meal, but now he set down his fork and met her eyes directly. "Why'd you come here?" "Pa said you didn't have much choice, but there's always choices." The table went still. Samuel's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Clara answered honestly. "You're right. There are always choices. Mine were to stay in Copper Falls and be invisible, or come here and be useful. I chose something useful." "But you don't know us," Daniel pressed. "We might be terrible." "Might be," Clara agreed. "But I figure 4 boys growing up without a mother, with a father doing his best to be both parents, probably aren't terrible so much as lost. And lost I can work with." Something flickered across Daniel's face, surprise maybe, or the beginning of respect. Samuel cleared his throat roughly, stood, and began collecting plates. The moment passed, but something had been established. After supper, Clara heated water and washed dishes properly, while the boys scattered to evening chores. Samuel lingered, drying each plate with a threadbare towel. Outside, darkness had fallen complete, and the windows reflected the warm glow of lamplight back at them. "You didn't have to say that," Samuel said quietly. "About them being lost. Wasn't saying it to be kind. Was saying it because it's true." Clara scrubbed at a particularly stubborn pot. "My father used to say hard things made people hard, but I think hard things just reveal what was already there. Your boys aren't hard. They're just careful." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, drying the same plate twice. "Their mother would have liked you." Clara glanced at him, surprised by the admission. "You don't know that." "Maybe not. But Rebecca always said the measure of a person was how they treated folks who couldn't do anything for them." He set the plate down carefully. "You made Charlie a promise before you knew if you'd want to keep it. That's the kind of thing she'd have respected." He left before Clara could respond, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, the door closing softly behind him. Clara stood alone in the kitchen, hands submerged in cooling dishwater, and allowed herself a moment to feel the weight of the day. This morning she'd been a burden, worthless, unloved. Tonight she was tired and uncertain, standing in a stranger's kitchen in the middle of nowhere. But she wasn't invisible anymore. She was here, solid and real, and 4 boys had eaten the food she'd cooked, and a scarred man with one eye had compared her to someone he'd loved. It wasn't much, but it was more than Copper Falls had ever offered. Clara dried her hands on her apron, banked the fire in the stove, and climbed the stairs to the small room at the end of the hall. The bed was narrow but comfortable, the quilt soft with age and washing. Through the window, stars scattered across the sky in wild profusion, more than she'd ever seen from town. She lay down, fully clothed, too exhausted to change, and listened to the house settle around her floorboards creaking, wind sighing through the eaves, the distant sound of one of the boys coughing. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, in this small room with its view of stars and hills, Clara Whitmore closed her eyes and slept without fear for the first time in years. And downstairs, Samuel Kane sat in his chair by the dying fire and wondered what kind of strange mercy had brought a woman with steel in her spine and kindness in her hands to his broken household, exactly when they needed her most. Dawn came cold and silver over the double sea, frost painting the pasture grass white as bone. Clara woke to unfamiliar sounds, cattle lowing in the distance, the creak of the barn door, boots crunching across frozen ground. She dressed quickly in the dim light, pinned her braid into a coil at the base of her neck, and descended the stairs while the house still held its nighttime quiet. Samuel stood at the kitchen stove, coaxing yesterday's coals back to life with the patience of long practice. He glanced up when she entered, surprise flickering across his face. "Didn't expect you to wake up this early." "Habit," Clara said simply. She moved to the water pump, filled the kettle, and set it on the warming stove without asking permission. "Coffee? If you're making it." He straightened, brushing ash from his hands. "I usually just chew some beans and call it done." Clara's mouth twitched. "That explains why you all look half-starved." Over the following weeks, a rhythm emerged, unspoken but steady. Clara rose before the sun, started the stove, ground coffee beans in the small mill she'd found buried in a cupboard. Samuel would appear from the barn, stamping mud from his boots, and they'd share the first quiet cup of the day while the house slowly woke around them. These morning moments became a kind of sanctuary, no demands, no questions, just the companionable silence of 2 people learning to exist in the same space without friction. The boys proved more complicated. Charlie attached himself to Clara like a shadow, following her from room to room, offering help that was sometimes useful and often earnest chaos. When she swept, he insisted on holding the dustpan. When she baked, he wanted to stir, resulting in flour clouds that coated the kitchen in white powder. But he was so eager, so desperately hungry for attention, that Clara couldn't bring herself to discourage him. One afternoon, while she mended a torn shirt, Charlie climbed onto the chair beside her, swinging his legs. "Can you teach me to sew?" Clara glanced at him, surprised. "That's usually considered women's work." "Pa says work is work. Don't matter who does it, long as it gets done." He watched her needle flash through the fabric. "And if I tear something again, I should know how to fix it myself." So she taught him simple running stitches at first, his small fingers clumsy but determined. When he completed his first repair, crooked but functional, he held it up with pride that could have lit the valley. Samuel, passing through, paused to examine the work. "Good job, son," Charlie beamed. Clara felt something warm unfold in her chest, something dangerously close to belonging. Luke proved easiest to reach through his curiosity. He'd hover near wherever Clara worked, questions spilling out like water from a cracked bucket. Why did bread need to rise? How did soap get things clean? Could you really navigate by stars? She answered each question seriously, treating his curiosity as valuable rather than bothersome. When she found him struggling over a primer one evening, letters swimming into incomprehensible shapes, she sat beside him at the table. "Tell me what you see," she said gently. "Just jumbles. The letters move around." His frustration was palpable, almost painful to witness. Clara studied him thoughtfully. "Maybe they're not moving. Maybe your eyes just see them different than mine do." She picked up a piece of paper, wrote his name in large, clear letters. "What if we try it this way? Trace each letter with your finger first, say it out loud, then write it yourself." They worked together until the lamp oil ran low, Luke's confidence growing with each small success. By the end, he'd written his full name 3 times without help, and his grin could have cracked his face in half. "Nobody ever made it make sense before," he said wonderingly. "That's because nobody tried your way instead of their way," Clara replied. "Smart isn't just one thing, Luke. It's lots of things, and you've got your own kind of smart." After that, he sought her out every evening, books in hand, ready to learn. Benjamin remained the fortress, walls high and gates locked. He obeyed when his father gave direct orders, but he met Clara's requests with bare minimum compliance, wrapped in sullen silence. If she asked him to fetch water, he'd fetch exactly 1 bucket and no more. If she requested he wash up for meals, he'd rinse his hands in cold water and consider the job done. Clara didn't push. She'd learned long ago that some doors opened only from the inside, but she watched, and she noticed things. Benjamin was always the first to volunteer for the hardest ranch work. He threw himself into physical labor with an intensity that seemed almost angry, as if he could exhaust whatever hurt lived inside him through sheer effort. His hands bore more calluses than a boy of 9 should carry. One morning, Clara found him in the barn before dawn, struggling with a saddle too heavy for him to lift properly. She moved to help without asking, taking half the weight. He stiffened, but didn't pull away. "Trying to get an early start on the day?" she asked mildly. "Pa's got fence to check in the north pasture. Thought I'd save him time by getting smoke ready." They worked together in silence, adjusting straps, checking cinches. Clara's hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent time around horses. Benjamin watched her sidelong, suspicion warring with something that might have been grudging respect. "You know your way around a saddle?" he finally admitted. "My grandfather kept horses. Taught me before he died." Clara brushed dust from her skirt. "Benjamin, can I ask you something?" His jaw set. "Depends. Why do you hate me?" The directness of the question seemed to catch him off guard. He opened his mouth, closed it, then scowled at the ground. "Don't hate. You act like you do. I act like I don't need another person to leave." The words came out hard and fast, like he'd been holding them behind a dam. Ma left. Mrs. Henderson left. The one before her left. You'll leave too, soon as you figure out we're in too much trouble. Clara crouched down, bringing herself to his eye level. "Your man didn't leave, Benjamin. She died. That's different. She didn't choose to go. Still gone, though." His eyes were too bright, his voice cracking. "And everybody else chose to go because there weren't enough to stay for. You listen to me." Clara's voice was firm but gentle. "I made Charlie a promise that I wouldn't leave without saying goodbye. But I'm making you a different promise. I won't leave, because you're difficult. I've been called difficult my whole life, so I recognize my own kind. And difficult people aren't the problem, Benjamin. Giving up on them is." He stared at her for a long moment, searching her face for lies. Whatever he found there must have satisfied something, because his shoulders dropped slightly and the fortress walls cracked just a little. "You really mean that?" "I really do." From that day forward, Benjamin didn't warm to her exactly, but the active resistance faded. He still only brought 1 bucket of water, but sometimes it would be followed by a 2nd bucket an hour later, delivered without comment. Progress came in inches, but it came. Daniel presented the most complicated challenge. At 15, he'd been the man of the house in all but name for too long. He'd taken care of his brothers, helped his father hold the ranch together, and shouldered responsibilities that should have belonged to adults. Clara's presence threatened that hard-won position. He tested her constantly, small challenges disguised as casual questions. "Can you handle a team of horses? Do you know anything about cattle? What would you do if one of us got hurt and Pa wasn't here?" Clara answered honestly, "Never," pretending to know more than she did, but never backing down from demonstrating what she did know. When Daniel implied she probably couldn't manage the laundry for 5 people, she spent 2 days washing, scrubbing, and drying everything they owned, then organized a system so the boys could help maintain it. When he suggested she likely didn't understand ranch accounts, she asked to see the ledgers. Samuel hesitated, but handed them over. Clara spent an evening reviewing the columns, her finger tracing lines of income and expense. At breakfast, she looked up calmly. "You're paying too much for grain. The supplier in Copper Falls is charging 15% above market rate. There's a mill in Bannock 30 miles east that'll sell for less and deliver if you order in bulk." Samuel set down his coffee cup. "How do you know that?" "I can read price circulars the same as anyone, and I'm good with numbers." She turned a page. "Also, you're not charging enough for beef on the hoof. The beef's going rate went up last spring, but you're still using old prices." Daniel leaned forward despite himself. "How much should we charge? $2 more per head, minimum. Maybe 3 if you negotiate right." Clara met his eyes directly. "Your father's been fair to the point of losing money. Fair is good, but fair doesn't keep a ranch running when everyone else is taking advantage." Samuel rubbed his jaw, something like amusement in his expression. "Guess we've been needing someone who understands figures." After that, Daniel stopped testing and started asking real questions about real problems, treating Clara like someone whose opinion mattered. The shift was subtle but seismic. One evening, he found her in the kitchen kneading bread dough with fierce efficiency. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said, leaning against the doorframe. "Of course. Why'd you really come here? And don't say just to be useful. There's more to it." Clara continued kneading, considering her answer. "You ever feel like the world decided who you were supposed to be before you got a chance to figure it out yourself?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's why I came. In Copper Falls, I was John Monroe's worthless daughter. Here, I get to be Clara. Just Clara. And maybe that Clara can be someone worth knowing." She shaped the dough into a ball, set it aside to rise. "What about you? Who are you when nobody's telling you to be the man of the house?" Daniel blinked, clearly not expecting the question turned back on him. He was quiet for a long moment. "Don't know. Been that person for so long, I forgot there might be others." "Well," Clara said gently, "maybe we can both figure out who we are without the weight of other people's expectations." Something in Daniel's face softened, not quite trust yet, but the beginning of possibility. The ranch itself began to transform under Clara's attention. She attacked the accumulated neglect with systematic determination. The kitchen, once chaotic, became organized. Every pot had its place, every ingredient its shelf. She scrubbed floors until they gleamed, washed windows until they vanished, mended curtains that had hung ragged for years. But she did more than clean. She noticed things. The pump in the yard squeaked, she oiled it. The porch step was loose, she found a hammer and nails and fixed it herself, while the boys watched in surprise. When frost threatened the last of the garden vegetables, she recruited Luke and Charlie to help her harvest everything that could be saved, then spent 2 days preserving what they'd gathered. Samuel would return from working cattle to find improvements he hadn't asked for and hadn't expected. The woodpile was organized and covered against rain. His tools were cleaned and sorted. Fresh bread cooling on the rack. He'd pause in doorways, watching Clara work, something unreadable in his expression. One evening, after the boys had gone to bed, He found her on the porch, wrapped in a shawl. Against the autumn chill, she was staring out at the valley, where early stars were beginning to emerge. "You've done something I couldn't," he said quietly. Clara glanced at him. "What's that?" "Made this place feel like a home again instead of just somewhere we survive." He moved to stand beside her, his shoulder nearly touching hers. "Boys are different. They laugh more, fight less. Even Ben's starting to come around. They're good boys. They just needed someone to see them." "You see a lot of things." Samuel's voice carried a weight she couldn't quite interpret. "Sometimes I wonder what you see when you look at me." Clara turned to face him fully, studying his scarred profile in the lamplight spilling from the windows. "I see someone who kept going when most people would have given up, someone who loves his sons enough to let a stranger into their lives because he knew they needed more than he could give alone. Someone who treats me like I'm worth respect even though the world said I wasn't worth a decent horse." She paused. "I see someone a lot stronger than he thinks he is." Samuel's throat worked as he swallowed hard. "Your father was wrong about you. You know that, right? About being too plain, too stubborn, about never being loved." "Maybe." Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. "Or maybe I just needed to be somewhere that could see past what I looked like to who I actually am." They stood in silence, the night settling around them like a blanket. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called lonely and wild. The wind carried the scent of hay and wood smoke and the particular smell of earth preparing for winter. Samuel cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you're here. Not just because of what you do, but because of, well, because of you." Before Clara could respond, a crash sounded from upstairs, followed by muffled cursing. Samuel sighed. "That'll be Ben knocking something over. Boy moves like a bull in a china shop." The moment broke, but something lingered in its wake, something warm and fragile and full of potential. As Samuel headed inside to check on his sons, Clara remained on the porch, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. Above her, stars scattered across the sky in wild profusion. A month ago, she'd been worthless, unloved, trapped in a town that looked through her as if she were made of glass. Now she stood on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by 4 boys who were learning to trust her, and one scarred man who saw her clearly in ways no one ever had. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was Clara, teacher, housekeeper, fixer of broken things, and for the first time in her life, that felt like enough. Inside, she could hear Samuel's low voice calming Benjamin, could hear Charlie's sleepy laughter at something his father said. The house hummed with life, with the messy, beautiful chaos of family. And Clara Whitmore, the daughter who'd been traded for whiskey and wagon repairs, walked back inside to the only place that had ever felt like home. Winter's first serious cold arrived on a Saturday morning, turning the valley into a landscape of silver frost and crystalline air. Samuel announced over breakfast that they needed supplies from Bannock, the larger town, 30 miles east, that Clara had mentioned in the ledgers. The journey would take most of the day, there and back. "Daniel can manage things here," Samuel said, glancing at Clara. "Thought you might want to come along. You've been cooped up on the ranch for near 2 months now. Might be good to see different faces." Clara hesitated, remembering Copper Falls and the weight of judgmental stares. But Benjamin piped up before she could decline. "You should go. You need fabric for that quilt you're making. And maybe something sweet from the mercantile. We ain't had proper candy in forever, Aunt." Clara corrected automatically, then caught the hopeful look on his face. "All right, I'll come." The ride to Bannock took them through a country that grew progressively more civilized, scattered homesteads appearing along the road, fields cleared and fenced, the mountains receding into distant blue profiles. Samuel kept the horses at a steady pace, the wagon loaded with empty crates to fill with supplies. He dressed in his better clothes, still work-worn but clean, his hat brushed, his boots polished to a dull shine. Clara had chosen her only good dress, a deep green wool she'd sewn herself years ago. She'd pinned her hair more carefully than usual, though she couldn't say exactly why it mattered. "You'll find Bannock different from Copper Falls," Samuel said as they crested a hill and the town came into view below. "Bigger, more prosperous. Mining money flows through there, along with cattle and timber. People are less," he paused, searching for words, "less concerned with other people's business?" Clara supplied, was going to say less petty, but that works too. Bannock sprawled across a wide valley, larger and more substantial than any town Clara had seen. A proper church, with a white steeple, dominated one end. The main street was broad and lined with two-story buildings, a bank with columns, a hotel with a painted sign, multiple mercantiles competing for business. People moved along wooden sidewalks, well-dressed and purposeful. The sound of a piano drifted from somewhere, incongruously cheerful. Samuel guided the wagon to the largest mercantile, helped Clara down, then began organizing his supply list. "This'll take a while. If you want to walk around, meet back here in 2 hours." Clara nodded, suddenly nervous. She'd been so insulated at the ranch, surrounded only by Samuel and the boys, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be perceived by strangers. She smoothed her skirts, lifted her chin, and stepped onto the sidewalk. The mercantile was warm and crowded, smelling of coffee and wool and the distinctive scent of new leather. Clara moved through the aisles, gathering what she needed: thread, needles, fabric for the quilt Benjamin had mentioned. She was examining a bolt of blue calico when a voice cut through the general murmur. "Well, I'll be damned. Is that Clara Whitmore?" She turned to find a woman her own age, staring at her, Margaret Walsh, who'd grown up 3 houses down from Clara in Copper Falls before her family moved away. Margaret wore an expensive dress with lace trim, her blonde hair elaborately curled, her hands soft and uncorlaced. She'd married well, clearly. "Margaret," Clara said carefully, "it's been years." "It has." Margaret's smile was sharp as cut glass. "I heard you'd left Copper Falls, though the stories about how varied considerably." She moved closer, eyes bright with curiosity that felt more invasive than friendly. "Some said you'd run off. Others said your father finally managed to marry you off, though who'd take you was anyone's guess." Her laugh tinkled like breaking china. "But here you are. Tell me everything." Before Clara could respond, 2 other women drifted over, drawn by the scent of gossip, the way sharks are drawn to blood. One was older, dressed in burgundy silk that spoke of money. The other was younger, pretty in a conventional way, wearing a wedding ring that caught the light. "Margaret, who's your friend?" the older woman asked. "This is Clara Whitmore, or she was, back in Copper Falls. We grew up together." Margaret's tone carried implications Clara couldn't quite parse. "I was just asking what brought her all the way to Bannock." "I live near here now," Clara said evenly. "On a ranch." "A ranch?" The younger woman's eyes lit up. "How romantic. Is your husband cattle?" "I'm not married." The temperature in the conversation dropped 10 degrees. Margaret's smile took on a pitying quality. "Oh, so you're working, then, as a... what? Exactly?" Clara felt the familiar weight of judgment settling over her shoulders. "I manage a household. A housekeeper," the older woman said, her tone making it sound like something distasteful. "Well, honest work is honest work, I suppose. For the Kane family," Clara added, meeting the woman's eyes directly. "Samuel Kane, of the Double C Ranch." Recognition flickered across Margaret's face, followed immediately by something that looked like scandalized delight. "Samuel Kane, the one-eyed veteran who lives out past Widow's Ridge with all those wild boys?" "He has 4 sons," Clara said, her voice cooling, "and they're not wild. They're growing boys who've had a hard time. I'm sure they are, dear. The older woman's condescension was thick enough to cut. But you must admit, the situation is rather unconventional. A young, unmarried woman living in a house full of men. People will talk. Let them, Clara replied, though heat was creeping up her neck. It's just that your reputation, Margaret began, fake concern dripping from every word. My reputation was ruined the day my father traded me for whiskey. Money, Clara interrupted, her voice level but hard. So whatever people want to say about me working for a decent man who treats me with respect, they can add it to the list of things I apparently should be ashamed of, but aren't. The three women exchanged loaded glances. The younger one actually took a small step backward. Margaret's smile had frozen into something brittle. Well, she said with false brightness, I suppose we all must make our way in the world as best we can. Though, I do hope you're being careful. Men like Cain, damaged as they are, sometimes have expectations that aren't entirely proper. Something white-hot flashed through Clara's chest, not embarrassment now, but pure rage. She was opening her mouth to deliver a response that would have scorched paint when a hand touched her elbow, gentle but grounding. There you are, Samuel said, appearing at her side like a solid wall between Clara and the circling wolves. His single eye took in the scene, with one sweep Clara's rigid posture, the women's predatory expressions, the tension thick enough to taste. I've finished with the supplies, ready to go. Samuel Cain, Margaret said, her voice suddenly syrupy. We were just getting reacquainted with your housekeeper. Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Clara, he said, not my housekeeper or Miss Whitmore. Just her name, spoken like it meant something. These ladies bothering you? Just making conversation, the older woman said quickly. Didn't look like a conversation from where I was standing. Looked more like 3 chickens pecking at one they decided didn't belong in the coop. Samuel's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. He turned his full attention to Margaret. You called her a housekeeper. That's not wrong, but it's not complete either. Clara manages my ranch, teaches my sons, keeps the accounts that have finally pulled us into profit, and does the work of 3 people without complaint. She saved calves I'd have lost, balanced books I couldn't make sense of, and turned my house back into a home after 4 years of just surviving. The mercantile had gone quiet. Other shoppers were trying not to obviously stare while obviously staring. The clerk behind the counter had frozen mid-transaction. Samuel wasn't finished. Now, I don't know what stories you've heard or what judgments you've decided to pass, but I'll tell you what I know. Clara Whitmore is worth 10 of most people I've met. She's smart, capable, kind to my boys, and the hardest worker I've ever seen. She came to us when we needed help, and she stayed because she's got more courage in her little finger than most folks manage in a lifetime. He took a breath, his scarred face set in lines of absolute conviction. So, if you want to gossip about how it's unconventional or worry about reputations, you go right ahead. But you do it away from her, and you do it knowing that Samuel Cain said she's under his protection, and anyone who disrespects her disrespects me and mine. The silence that followed was profound. Margaret had gone pale. The older woman's mouth hung slightly open. Even the pretty young one looked shocked. Clara stood frozen, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. No one had ever defended her like that. No one had ever stood up and claimed her as worth protecting, worth fighting for. Samuel turned to her, his expression softening. You got what you needed? Yes, Clara managed, her voice barely steady. Then let's go home. He offered his arm, not his hand for assistance, but his arm like she was a lady being escorted. Clara took it, felt the solid warmth of him, and together they walked out of the mercantile with every eye in the place following them. They didn't speak until they were back at the wagon, supplies loaded, horses pointed toward home. Samuel climbed up beside her, took the reins, then paused. I'm sorry, he said, quietly. Clara blinked. For what? For what they said to you. For not getting there sooner. His jaw worked. People can be cruel when they're small-minded and bored. You didn't do anything wrong, Clara said. You did everything right. Samuel, what you said in there, I meant every word. He looked at her directly, that single eye holding more warmth than she'd known eyes could carry. You need to know that. It wasn't just talk to shut them up. It was truth. Clara's throat tightened with emotions she couldn't name. No one's ever stood up for me like that. Then everyone else has been a fool. Samuel snapped the reins gently, and the wagon rolled forward. You're not just the housekeeper, Clara. Haven't been for a long time. He trailed off, seeming to struggle with words. You're important. To the boys, to the ranch, to me. The last two words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that made Clara's pulse race. They rode in silence for a while, the hot town falling away behind them, the familiar mountains rising ahead. The sun had begun its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. In the wagon bed, supplies rattled and shifted with each bump in the road. Finally, Clara spoke. Margaret Walsh, the blonde woman, we grew up together. She married a banker's son, has a fine house, probably servants, everything I was supposed to want. And, Samuel asked quietly, and I don't envy her a bit. She looked at me like I was something to pity, but Samuel. Clara turned to face him. I'd rather have one honest day at the Double C than a lifetime of her kind of respectability. I'd rather teach Luke his letters and fix fences with Benjamin and listen to Charlie's stories than attend 100 tea parties with women who smile while they stick knives in your back. Something shifted in Samuel's expression, something that looked like hope mixed with wonder. You mean that? I do. Clara surprised herself with how much she meant. When I left Copper Falls, I thought I was going to do something hard, and it has been hard, but it's also been real. Your sons are real. This work is real. What we're building is real. She paused, then took a risk. What I feel when I'm there is real. Samuel's hand, still holding the reins, moved slightly closer to hers on the bench. Not touching, not yet, but close enough that she could feel the heat of him. What do you feel? Clara's heart hammered. This was dangerous territory, vulnerable ground. But after what he'd done for her in the mercantile, after the way he'd claimed her as worth protecting, she owed him honesty. I feel like I matter, she said softly. Like I'm seen and valued for who I actually am, not who someone decided I should be. I feel, she swallowed hard, I feel like maybe my father was wrong. Maybe I could be loved by the right person. By someone who saw past the surface to what's underneath. Samuel's throat worked. The horses plodded on, faithful and sure. The mountains drew closer, their peaks catching the last golden light. Clara, Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion, I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I'm saying it without any expectation attached. You're free here. You can leave whenever you want. But He stopped, started again. These past months, watching you with my boys, seeing how you've brought light back into that house, how you handle everything that gets thrown at you with strength and grace. I've come to care for you, not because you're useful, though you are, not because the boys need you, though they do, but because you're you, and He struggled for words. You're extraordinary. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Samuel, you don't have to say anything, he continued quickly. I know there's an imbalance here. I'm your employer. You're in my home, and that complicates everything. I won't press you or make you uncomfortable. But after today, after hearing those women try to diminish you, I realized I couldn't let another day pass without you knowing that someone sees exactly how remarkable you are. The wagon crested the final hill. and the double sea spread out below them, the barn, the house, smoke rising from the chimney where Daniel had kept the fire going. Cattle dotted the pastures. The creek caught the fading light like a silver thread. Home. Clara reached out and placed her hand over Samuel's where it rested on his knee. His hand turned, palm up, and their fingers interlaced calloused skin against calloused skin. Strength meeting strength. "I care for you too," she said quietly. "I have for a while now, but I was afraid to name it. Afraid it was just gratitude or relief or anything other than what it actually is." "What is it?" Samuel's voice was barely above a whisper. Clara looked at their joined hands, then up at his scarred face, the face that had become dear to her, the missing eye that had stopped mattering weeks ago, the man who'd shown her that worth wasn't measured in beauty or convention, but in courage and kindness. "It's love," she said simply. "Real, honest, terrifying love." Samuel's breath caught. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned toward her. Clara met him halfway. The kiss was gentle, tentative, tasting of possibility and promise. When they drew apart, both their eyes were bright. "Well," Samuel said, a smile breaking across his face like sunrise, "that's going to cause even more gossip in Bannock." Clara laughed, the sound surprised and genuine and free. "Let them talk. We've got better things to do." The wagon rolled down the hill toward home, toward 4 boys waiting for candy and stories, toward a house that had learned to hold love again, toward a life built not on what they'd lost, but on what they'd found in each other. And behind them, the sun set over the mountains, painting the whole world gold. Winter descended in earnest, blanketing the valley in snow that transformed the double sea into a study in white and shadow. But inside the ranch house, warmth radiated from more than just the stove. The kiss shared on the wagon ride home had changed something fundamental. Not the daily rhythms of work and meals, but the quality of silence between Clara and Samuel, the way their eyes met across rooms, the small touches that spoke of belonging. They courted properly, despite living under the same roof. Samuel would ask permission to sit beside her in the evening. Clara would wait to be invited before joining him on his morning rounds. It was old-fashioned and probably unnecessary given how much time they already spent together, but it felt important, a way of honoring what was growing between them with the respect it deserved. The boys noticed, of course. Daniel caught them holding hands by the fireplace one evening and simply smiled, saying nothing. Charlie asked outright if Clara was going to be his new man, then accepted her gentle explanation that these things took time with the patience of someone who'd already decided the outcome. Even Benjamin, still guarded but softening, seemed to relax into the certainty of her permanent presence. By January, the ranch's prosperity had become undeniable. Samuel's cattle sale in the fall, negotiated at the higher prices Clara had identified, brought in $800 more than the previous year. The bulk grain order from the Bannock mills saved them enough to purchase 3 new breeding heifers. The ledgers, now meticulously maintained, showed the ranch finally pulling ahead instead of just holding even. One evening, Samuel spread the account books across the kitchen table, studying the columns with something like wonder. "We're actually making money," he said. "Real money, not just enough to survive on." Clara looked up from her mending. "That's what happens when you charge what things are worth and stop letting suppliers take advantage. That's what happens when someone's smart. Enough to see past my stubbornness takes over the business side." Samuel tapped a figure with his finger. "At this rate, we can expand the herd next spring. Maybe even hire proper help for the heavy work, give the boys more time for school." "School," Clara repeated thoughtfully. She'd been teaching them at the kitchen table, but their education remained haphazard, squeezed between chores and weather. "What if we brought school here?" Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Here? Other ranches have children too. The Hendersons to the south have 3. The Miller place has at least 2. What if I taught them all, maybe 2 days a week? Families could take turns hosting, but we'd start here. Clara warmed to the idea as she spoke. Give the children something consistent, give the mothers a break, build community. You'd take on more work? Samuel asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I'd take on work that matters. Clara set aside her mending. Your boys are bright, Samuel, but they need more than I can give them alone. Learning works better in groups. They challenge each other, help each other. And Lord knows this valley could use more folks who can read and cipher properly. Within a month, the Double C school was reality. Clara taught every Tuesday and Friday in the front room, 6 children ranging from Charlie's age to a 14-year-old girl from the Henderson Ranch. She covered reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and history, structuring lessons around the ranch calendar, making education practical as well as theoretical. When she taught multiplication, she used cattle counts. Geography lessons referenced actual trails and territories the families knew. The children thrived. More importantly, their parents began to see Clara differently. She wasn't just Samuel Kane's housekeeper anymore, she was the valley's teacher, a woman whose intelligence and dedication benefited the entire community. Women who might have whispered behind her back instead brought her preserves and fabric scraps, small tokens of gratitude. Mrs. Henderson, a practical woman with weathered hands and a direct manner, pulled Clara aside after collecting her children one afternoon. My husband wanted me to tell you we're grateful. Our Sally's been reading to us at night, actual books, not just primers. We never thought we'd have that. Sally's a dedicated student, Clara replied. She'll go far if she wants to. Maybe. Mrs. Henderson studied Clara appraisingly. You're good for this valley, Miss Whitmore. Good for those boys. Good for Sam Kane. Good for all of us. Don't let anyone tell you different. It was, Clara realized, the first time a respectable married woman had offered her unconditional approval. The weight of it settled warm in her chest. By February, Samuel's courtship had progressed from holding hands to stolen kisses in the barn, from careful distance to comfortable closeness. But he still hadn't spoken the question Clara knew was coming. She could see him working up to it, the way he'd start to say something serious, then lose his nerve. The way he'd study her when he thought she wasn't looking, as if memorizing her face for some important purpose. The question came on a Sunday morning, unseasonably warm for winter. Samuel had suggested a ride to check the northern fence line, just the 2 of them. They rode in comfortable silence, Clara on the chestnut mare, who'd become her preferred mount, Samuel on his steady roan. The snow had begun to melt, revealing brown grass beneath, and the creek ran high with runoff. They stopped at a high point overlooking the valley, the ranch visible below barn and house and corrals, smoke rising from the chimney, tiny figures of the boys moving between buildings doing their chores. From this distance, it looked like something from a painting, peaceful and permanent. Samuel dismounted, then helped Clara down. They stood together looking at the view, his hand finding hers. Naturally. When I first bought this land, Samuel said quietly, I thought I was building something for me and Rebecca. Then she died, and I thought I was just building something for the boys, a place where they could grow up safe and strong. But now, he turned to face Clara fully. Now, I think maybe I was building it for us, for this family we're becoming. Clara's heart began to race. Samuel, let me finish before I lose my courage. He smiled, that rare expression that transformed his scarred face into something beautiful. Clara Whitmore, I know our beginning wasn't conventional. I know people will always talk about how we came together, but I don't care about that. What I care about is that you've taken a half-dead ranch and broken family and breathed life back into both. You've made my sons believe in themselves again. You've made me believe in more than just surviving. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band, not fancy, but solid and real. This was my grandmother's. It's the only fine thing my family ever owned, and my mother gave it to me before she died. I carried it through the war, and I gave it to Rebecca when I proposed to her. When she died, I put it away, thinking I'd never have cause to bring it out again. Clara's eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall. But then you came into my life, Samuel continued, his voice thick with emotion. And suddenly, the future looked like something worth planning for instead of just enduring. So I'm asking you, here where we can see everything we've built together, will you marry me? Not because of obligation or convenience, but because I love you and I want to spend whatever years I have left building a life with you. Clara looked at the ring, then at Samuel's face, that dear, scarred face that had become the very definition of home. She thought about her father's words, "You'll never be loved," and felt them crumble into dust. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears now streaming down her face. "Yes, I'll marry you." Samuel's whoop of joy startled the horses. He swept Clara into his arms, spinning her around despite his bad leg, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. They kissed there on the hillside, with the valley spread below them and the mountains standing witness. And Clara felt something settle deep in her soul, the certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. The wedding took place in late March, when the first wildflowers had begun to emerge and the world was tentatively green again. They married in the small church in Bannock, with the Valley families in attendance and the boys standing proud in new shirts Clara had sewn. Charlie served as ring-bearer, taking his duties with solemn importance. Daniel stood beside his father as best man, his resemblance to Samuel striking in the morning light. Clara wore a dress she'd made herself from dove-grey silk, simple but elegant, with her mother's locket at her throat. She'd never imagined her wedding day would look like this, a small church filled with ranching families, a scarred groom with one eye, 4 boys who'd become her sons before she'd become their stepmother. It was nothing like the fairy tale weddings in books. It was better. When Samuel lifted her veil and kissed her as the minister pronounced them man and wife, the congregation erupted in genuine applause. Even Margaret Walsh, sitting in the back pew with her banker husband, had to acknowledge the radiant happiness on Clara's face. The celebration afterward was held at the Double C, neighbors bringing food and drink, children running wild through the house that had been transformed for the occasion. Someone had brought a fiddle, and impromptu dancing broke out in the yard. Clara found herself swept from partner to partner, first Samuel, then Daniel, then various ranchers, who wanted to congratulate the bride personally. Mrs. Henderson caught Clara during a break in the dancing. "You've done well for yourself, Mrs. Kane," she said, the title sitting naturally in the air between them. "But more than that, you've done well for all of us. This valley's better with you in it." "The valley's better with all of us helping each other," Clara replied, but she couldn't help smiling. As evening fell and guests began departing, Samuel found Clara on the porch, watching the sun set over their land, truly theirs now, bound by law and love. He wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Happy?" he asked. "Happier than I knew was possible," Clara answered honestly. She looked down at the ring on her finger, still getting used to its weight. "A year ago, I was nobody, nothing. My father told me I'd never be loved, and I believed him. And now—" Clara turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd seen worth in her when the world saw only burden. "Now, I'm somebody's wife, for someone's mother, a teacher, a partner, a woman with purpose and place. Now I know my father was wrong about everything that matters." Samuel kissed her forehead gently. "He was wrong about you from the start. You were always extraordinary, Clara. You just needed the space to show it. Inside the house, the boys were cleaning up, their laughter and bickering a familiar comfort. The ranch stretched around them, prosperous and solid, built on hard work and mutual respect. The mountains stood guard over the valley, eternal and strong. Clara Kane, no longer Whitmore, no longer the worthless daughter, stood in her husband's embrace and felt the completeness of transformation. She'd been sold for whiskey money and wagon repairs, treated as less than worthless by the man who should have loved her most. But she'd survived. More than survived, she'd flourished. The girl who'd climbed into a stranger's wagon with nothing but a canvas bag and wounded pride had become a woman with a home, a family, a purpose, and a love that filled every corner of her life with light. And standing there, on the porch of the Double C Ranch, with spring spreading across the valley and her whole future stretching ahead like an unwritten story, Clara finally understood what her mother had tried to tell her years ago. Worth isn't given by others. It's claimed by ourselves, in the choices we make and the lives we build from broken pieces. She'd been told she'd never be loved. She'd proven them all catastrophically wrong, and tomorrow she'd wake up as Mrs. Samuel Kane and continue building the life that was, against all odds, beautifully and completely hers. Spring had fully arrived by May, transforming the Double C into a landscape of new grass and wild lupine. The cattle had dropped their calves successfully, adding 30 healthy heads to the herd. The garden Clara had expanded now produced more than the family could eat, allowing her to trade surplus vegetables with neighboring ranches. The school met regularly, and the children's progress had become a source of valley-wide pride. Clara had been Mrs. Samuel Kane for 2 months, and the title had settled onto her shoulders like it had always belonged there. She moved through her days with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she fit in the world. The boys called her Ma now without hesitation. Samuel's hand found hers automatically whenever they were in the same room. The house hummed with the comfortable chaos of a family that had learned to love each other. On a Tuesday afternoon, Clara was in the garden with Charlie and 2 of the Henderson children, teaching them about companion planting, which vegetables grew well together and which competed. The spring sun was warm on her back, and Charlie was explaining to the younger Henderson girl why tomatoes and basil made good neighbors. Because they help each other grow, he said seriously. Like people do when they're family. Clara smiled at the simple wisdom, then heard hoofbeats approaching. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun. A rider was coming up the main road alone, moving slowly, hunched in the saddle in a way that spoke of either exhaustion or drink. Something cold settled in Clara's stomach even before she could make out the man's features. Samuel emerged from the barn, Daniel beside him, both of them tracking the approaching rider with the wariness of men who'd learned not to trust unexpected visitors. The rider drew closer, and Clara's breath caught painfully in her chest. Even from a distance, even worn down by months and miles, she recognized him. Henry Whitmore sat on a swayback horse that looked 3 days past useful, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had thinned considerably since she'd last seen him. His face had gone from red to grey, and he rode like a man barely holding himself upright. When he reached the yard and dismounted, he nearly fell, catching himself on the port saddle with trembling hands. "Clara," he said, his voice a rasp of what it had been. "There's my girl." The words hit like a slap. Clara stood frozen, the trowel still in her hand, Charlie pressed protectively against her side. She felt the weight of months collapsing, all the healing, all the growth, all the distance she'd put between herself and the man who'd told her she was worthless. Samuel moved to stand between Clara and her father, Daniel flanking him. "Mr. Whitmore," Samuel said, his tone carefully neutral. "Wasn't expecting you." "Bet you weren't." Henry's laugh turned into a cough that doubled him over. When he straightened, his eyes still that clouded, ruined blue found Clara again. "Look at you, all settled and respectable. Heard you went and married him." "I did." Clara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "What are you doing here? Can't a father visit his daughter?" Henry tried for jovial and landed somewhere near pathetic. "Come all this way to see how you're getting on. Make sure Cain here's treating you right." "He treats her like the treasure she is," Daniel said sharply. "Which is more than you ever did." Henry's face darkened. "Boy, you mind your manners." "I'm talking to my daughter." "She's my mother now," Daniel replied, not backing down an inch. "And you don't get to talk to her unless she wants you to." Clara felt a surge of fierce pride in the boy young man, really who'd once been so wary of her and now stood as her champion. She gently moved Charlie toward the house. "Take the Henderson children inside. Tell Luke to stay with you." "But Ma," Charlie protested. "Inside, sweetheart." Now. Something in her tone brooked no argument. Charlie gathered the other children and retreated to the porch, though all three watched with wide eyes from the doorway. Clara stepped forward, coming to stand beside Samuel. His hand found the small of her back, not possessive, just present, steady. "Why are you really here?" Clara asked. Her father. Henry's attempt at innocence crumbled quickly. "Fine. You want plain speaking, I'll give you plain speaking." He gestured vaguely at the ranch, the solid barn, the expanded corrals, the house with its new shutters. "You've done well for yourself. Better than I expected, truth be told. Figured you'd run off or get sent back inside in a month. Your faith in me was always inspiring." Clara said dryly, "I'm not here to fight." Henry raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm here because I'm in a bad way, Clara. Real bad. Got debts in 3 towns. No work, no prospects. Been sleeping in barns and eating scraps." His voice took on a wheedling tone. "But you're my daughter, and blood's blood. Figure now that you're married to a prosperous rancher, you could spare something for your old father. Help me get back on my feet." The audacity of it struck Clara breathless. "You want money, just enough to settle my debts and get a fresh start. Maybe $50. Nothing to a ranch this size, but it'd mean everything to me." His eyes, calculating despite their cloudiness, slid to Samuel. "Cain, you seem like a decent man. Surely you'd help your wife's father in his time of need." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, letting Clara take the lead, trusting her to handle this her way. Clara studied the man who'd raised her, looking for any trace of the father he'd been before whiskey and bitterness had hollowed him out. She found nothing but manipulation and desperation. "You told me I'd never be loved," she said quietly. "The day you arranged to trade me away, you looked me in the eye and said I was too plain, too stubborn, too much trouble for any man. You said I was worthless." Henry shifted uncomfortably. "I was drunk. Didn't mean half of what I said." "You meant all of it," Clara corrected. "And you know what? It almost destroyed me. I believed you. I thought maybe you were right. Maybe I was just a burden taking up space." Her voice strengthened. "But then I came here. And these boys," she gestured toward Daniel, toward the house where the others waited. "They didn't see worthless. They saw someone who could teach them and care for them and make their home feel safe again." She took Samuel's hand, lacing their fingers together. "And this man didn't see damaged goods. He saw someone strong and capable and worth building a life with. He saw me, Father. Really saw me, in ways you never did." "Clara, I know I made mistakes," Henry began. "Mistakes?" The word came out as sharp as breaking glass. "You sold me. For whiskey and wagon repairs. You looked at your own daughter and decided she was worth less than 2 months of drinking money. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. I was desperate. So was I." Clara's voice rang across the yard, surprising even herself with its force. "I was desperate for a father who loved me, who protected me, who saw me as more than an inconvenience. But you were too drunk to notice, too wrapped up in your own grief to care that I was grieving too for Ma, for the family we used to be, for any chance at a normal life." Tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice didn't waver. I came to this ranch with nothing, a canvas bag and a broken heart, and the certainty that I was exactly as worthless as you'd told me I was. But you know what I found here? I found people who saw worth in me, who gave me chances to prove myself, who loved me not despite my rough edges, but because of them. She stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and her father. So no, I won't give you $50. I won't give you anything except the truth. You don't get to claim me as your daughter now that it's convenient. You gave up that right when you traded me away like livestock. I was your blood then, but you didn't care. You don't get to care now, just because I've made something of myself. Henry's face had gone through several shades of emotion, anger, shame, calculation, and finally a kind of bitter resignation. So that's how it is. You've gotten too good for your own father. No, Clara said firmly. I've gotten too healthy to let you poison me anymore. There's a difference. After everything I did for you, everything you did for me? Clara's laugh was harsh. You fed me and put a roof over my head until I was old enough to work. Then you worked me like a servant while you drank yourself stupid. You never once asked what I wanted, what I dreamed about, what scared me or made me happy. You didn't raise me, Father. You just kept me alive long enough to trade me for something you wanted more. Samuel's hand tightened on hers, a silent gesture of support. Daniel had moved closer, and now Luke emerged from the house, followed by Benjamin and Charlie. They arranged themselves around Clara like a wall, her family, chosen and real, standing between her and the man who'd hurt her most. Henry looked at them all, and something in his expression shifted, a flicker of what might have been regret, quickly smothered by pride. Fine. Keep your money, keep your new family and your fancy ranch. But don't come crying to me when things go wrong. Don't expect anything from me ever again. I haven't expected anything from you for a very long time, Clara said softly. That's the one lesson you taught me. Well, don't rely on Henry Whitmore for anything, least of all love. Henry's face twisted. He turned to his horse, fumbling with the reins, then paused and looked back one final time. Your mother would be ashamed of you. The words were meant to wound, one last attempt to hurt her. But Clara felt nothing except a vast, peaceful certainty. No, she said calmly. Ma would be proud of me. Proud that I survived you. Proud that I built something real from nothing. Proud that I learned the difference between the family you're born into and the family you choose. She squeezed Samuel's hand. Ma always said love was a choice. You made every day. These people choose to love me, and I choose to love them. That's what she'd be proud of. Henry had no answer to that. He climbed onto his horse with difficulty, his hands shaking on the reins. For a moment, Clara almost felt pity this broken man who'd destroyed his own life, one bottle at a time. But pity wasn't the same as obligation. There's a rooming house in Bannock, Samuel said quietly. Mrs. Fletcher runs it. Tell her I sent you. She'll give you a meal and a bed for the night. After that, you're on your own. It was more kindness than Henry deserved, and they all knew it. Henry nodded once, stiffly, then turned his horse toward the road. Clara watched him ride away, getting smaller and smaller until he disappeared over the ridge. She felt Samuel's arm come around her shoulders, felt Daniel press close to her other side, felt Charlie wrap his arms around her waist from behind. Her family, real and chosen and here. You all right, Ma? Luke asked softly. Clara wiped her eyes, surprised to find she was smiling through her tears. Yes, she said, and meant it completely. I really am. What he said about you not being loved, Charlie said fiercely, that was stupid. We love you so much. I know, sweetheart. Clara knelt down, gathering him into a hug. And you know what? That's all that matters. Not what he thinks, not what anyone who doesn't know me thinks. Just the people who are here, who chose to be family. Samuel helped her to her feet, his scarred face soft with pride and love. You were magnificent, he said quietly, for her ears only. Stronger than he ever deserved. I learned from the best. Clara leaned into him, drawing strength from his solidity. You showed me what it looked like to stand up for what matters. I was just following your example. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into nighttime quiet, Clara and Samuel sat on the porch steps, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of early roses. "Do you think he'll come back?" Clara asked. No. Samuel was certain. He wanted easy money, and you made it clear there wasn't any. Men like that don't stick around when there's nothing to gain. Clara nodded, leaning her head on his shoulder. I thought I'd feel worse. Seeing him like that, so broken down, I thought I'd feel guilty for not helping. But you don't? No. Clara traced the ring on her finger, Samuel's grandmother's gold band that meant she belonged somewhere, to someone. I feel free. Like I was carrying this weight I didn't even know was there, and now it's gone. He doesn't have any power over me anymore. His words can't hurt me because I know they're lies. Because you know you're loved, Samuel said softly. Because I know I'm loved, Clara agreed. By you, by the boys, by this life we've built together. My father was wrong about me, about everything, and now he knows it too. They sat in comfortable silence, Clara's hand in Samuel's, the ranch settling around them for the night. Somewhere in the barn, a horse stamped and nickered. In the distance, a coyote sang its lonely song. The mountains stood dark against the star-filled sky, eternal and unchanging. Clara thought about the girl who'd climbed into a wagon 6 months ago, believing she was worthless and unloved. That girl seemed like a stranger, now someone from a different life, a different world. Clara Kane was stronger, braver, more certain of her place in the world. "Thank you," she said suddenly. Samuel looked at her questioningly. "For what?" "For seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for standing beside me today, for loving me into becoming someone I'm proud to be." Samuel brought her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles gently. "You were always that person, Clara. I just got to watch you. Remember it." And sitting there on the porch of the home they'd built together, Clara finally let go of the last chains her father had wrapped around her heart. He was gone now, powerless, and she was here surrounded by love, anchored in purpose, free in ways she'd never imagined possible. The girl he'd sold was gone forever. The woman she'd become had earned every inch of her freedom. And tomorrow, she'd wake up and continue building the life that was, against all odds and all cruelty, beautifully and completely hers. 3 years passed, like water flowing over smooth stones, steady, persistent, transforming everything it touched. By the summer of 1883, the Double C Ranch had become the benchmark against which other operations in the valley measured themselves. The cattle herd numbered over 200 head. The barn had been expanded twice. A second bunkhouse stood ready for the seasonal hands they now employed during roundup and branding. But the most visible transformation was the house itself. What had once been a weathered bachelor dwelling now gleamed with fresh paint, white clapboard, with dark green shutters that Clara had insisted on. Flower boxes burst with color beneath every window. The porch, rebuilt and expanded, wrapped fully around the house with carved railings that Samuel had fashioned during winter evenings. A swing hung at one end, where Clara often sat with their youngest child. Because there were 6 children now. Clara stood in the kitchen on a July morning, the window open to catch the breeze, watching Daniel, now 18 and tall, as his father work a young horse in the corral with the patience and skill of someone twice his age. Luke, 15, was repairing tack in the shade of the barn, his hands quick and sure. Benjamin, at 12, had finally grown into his stubborn determination, channeling it into becoming the best rider in 3 counties. And Charlie, 9 now, was helping his father mend the north pasture fence, his chatter carrying across the distance. In the cradle near the stove, 3-month-old Rebecca slept peacefully, named for the mother the older boys remembered and the new mother who'd helped them heal. And toddling around Clara's feet, getting into everything with the cheerful destructiveness of a 2-year-old, was Thomas, called Tommy, whose arrival had surprised everyone and delighted them all. Clara's hands moved automatically through the familiar rhythm of pie-making, rolling dough on the floured counter while keeping one eye on Tommy and one ear tuned to Rebecca's breathing. She'd become expert at doing 6 things at once, at being everywhere her family needed her to be. The Valley School had grown beyond anything she'd imagined. What had started with 6 children now served nearly 20, meeting 3 days a week in a small schoolhouse the community had built together on neutral ground between ranches. Clara still taught, though she'd recruited Mrs. Miller, a former teacher from Boston who'd married a homesteader to help with the older students. Several of Clara's first pupils were now reading Shakespeare and solving complex mathematical problems. The territorial governor had even visited last fall, wanting to see the rural education model that was producing such impressive results. He'd spent an afternoon observing Clara's teaching methods, then written an article for the Helena newspaper praising her innovative approach. The article had called her a pioneer in practical education and living proof that intelligence and dedication matter more than formal credentials. Samuel had framed the article and hung it in the parlor, right beside their wedding photograph. A knock at the door pulled Clara from her thoughts. She wiped flour from her hands and opened it to find Margaret Walsh standing on the porch, looking considerably less polished than she had 3 years ago. Her expensive dress was well worn now, her face thinner, her eyes carrying shadows they hadn't held before. "Margaret," Clara said, surprised, "what brings you all the way out here?" Margaret's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "I need to speak with you. May I come in?" Clara stepped aside, gesturing her into the kitchen. Tommy immediately toddled over to investigate the visitor, and Margaret's face softened as she looked down at him. "He's beautiful," she said quietly. "He has Samuel's eyes, and my stubbornness, according to his father." Clara lifted Tommy onto her hip. "Can I offer you tea?" "Please." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Clara had served her first meal to the Kane family, where she'd taught the boys their lessons, where she'd balanced the ranch accounts and planned her lessons. The table had acquired more scars over the years, more memories embedded in its grain. Margaret wrapped her hands around the teacup but didn't drink. "I suppose you heard about my husband." Clara had heard, though she'd kept the news to herself. Jonah Walsh had been caught embezzling from his father's bank, thousands of dollars lost to gambling, debts. He was in prison now, and the Walsh family name was ruined. "I heard something," Clara said carefully. "We've lost everything. The house, the accounts, my jewelry, all seized to pay back what Jonah stole. His father won't speak to me. My own family in Copper Falls has turned their backs." Margaret's voice was brittle, on the edge of breaking. "I'm living in a boarding house in Bannock, taking in washing to pay rent. Me, who used to have 3 servants." Clara waited, sensing there was more. "I came to apologize," Margaret said finally, meeting Clara's eyes. "For what I said in the mercantile, for how I treated you, for," she swallowed hard, "for being exactly the kind of person who judges others based on circumstances instead of character. You tried to tell me that honest work was better than false respectability, and I laughed at you, but you were right. About everything." Clara studied the woman across from her, seeing genuine remorse beneath the pride. "What do you need, Margaret?" "I don't deserve help," Margaret said quickly. "I know that, but I thought maybe you'd know of someone who needs a maid or a cook. I can clean, I can sew. I've had to learn these past months. I'm not too proud anymore to do whatever work I can find." The old Clara, the one who'd been sold and shamed, might have felt vindicated by this reversal. But the woman Clara had felt only compassion. "Can you teach?" Margaret blinked. Teach. Reading, writing, basic arithmetic. The Valley School needs another instructor. Mrs. Miller is moving to Butte next month. Her husband's taking a position with the mining company. The community can't pay much, but there's a small cottage attached to the schoolhouse. It's not fancy, but it's clean and private. You'd recommend me? Margaret's voice cracked. After how I treated you? People deserve second chances, Clara said simply. I got mine. Seems only fair to pass it along. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say. Say you'll do the work with integrity and treat the children with respect. That's all anyone can ask. After Margaret left with a teaching position secured and something like hope in her eyes, Samuel came in from the fields, dusty and tired, but smiling when he saw Clara. He'd aged well, his face more lined, but his remaining eye still bright, his body still strong despite the occasional ache from old war wounds. Who was that leaving? He asked, washing up at the basin. Margaret Walsh. She needed help, so I gave it to her. Samuel dried his hands, studying Clara's face. The same Margaret Walsh who tried to tear you down in the mercantile. The very same. Clara lifted Rebecca from her cradle, the baby stirring awake. She apologized. People change, Samuel. I did. You did. Why not her? Samuel crossed to her, pressing a kiss to her temple. You're too forgiving. I'm exactly forgiving enough. Clara smiled up at him. Besides, the school needs a teacher, and Margaret needs purpose. Seems like a practical solution to me. That evening, the entire family gathered for supper, all 8 of them crowded around the expanded table, passing dishes and talking over each other in the comfortable chaos Clara had come to love. Daniel announced he'd been offered a position as foreman on the Henderson Ranch, a job that would let him prove himself beyond his father's shadow. Luke had been accepted to a training program for veterinary medicine in Helena starting next spring. Benjamin wanted to enter the regional horse competition. Charlie needed new books. He'd read through everything they owned twice. Samuel caught Clara's eye across the table, his expression warm with contentment. This was what they'd built together, not just a prosperous ranch, but a family that was strong and confident and reaching toward futures that seemed limitless. After the children had scattered to evening chores and the babies were asleep, Clara stood at the kitchen window watching the sun set over the mountains. Samuel came to stand beside her as he did most evenings, his presence a comfort she'd never take for granted. You've been quiet, he observed. Just thinking. Clara leaned into him, his arm coming automatically around her waist. About how far we've come. How different everything is from that first day. Samuel was quiet for a moment, then said, I never told you what I was thinking that day in Copper Falls. When your father was making his devil's bargain, what were you thinking? That you looked like you'd already been broken and put back together wrong too many times? That your eyes were the saddest thing I'd ever seen, and I'd seen men die on battlefields. He paused. And I thought, if I left you there, you'd disappear entirely. So I made the deal, not because I needed a housekeeper, but because you needed saving, and I was the only one who seemed to notice. Clara turned to face him fully, surprised by this confession. You never said, didn't seem right to tell you I'd rescued you. Made it sound like you were helpless, and you were never that. You were just, he searched for words, buried. Under years of being told you didn't matter, I just gave you space to dig yourself out. We saved each other, Clara said softly. This house was dying when I got here. You and the boys were just surviving, not living. I needed you as much as you needed me. Maybe. Samuel's thumb traced circles on her hand. But I got the better end of the deal. I got Clara Kane, teacher, mother, partner, the smartest person I know, and the woman who makes every day worth living. Clara's throat tightened with emotion. My father told me I'd never be loved because I was too plain, too stubborn, too difficult. For years, I believed him. Even when I came here, Part of me was waiting to prove him right, waiting to be too much trouble, waiting for you all to decide I wasn't worth the effort. And now? Now I know he was wrong about me, but right. About one thing I am stubborn and difficult and too much. Clara smiled through tears. But those aren't flaws. They're the things that made me strong enough to survive him, brave enough to come here, determined enough to build something real from nothing. I'm not loved, despite being difficult. I'm loved because being difficult meant I never gave up. Samuel cupped her face gently, his scarred hand rough against her cheek. You're loved because you're you. Every stubborn, brilliant, fierce, kind piece of you, and our children are growing up knowing that worth isn't about being easy or convenient, it's about being true. Through the window, Clara could see the ranch spread out in the gathering darkness, the barn she'd helped repair, the garden she'd planted, the corrals holding cattle that represented their shared prosperity. The mountains stood eternal against the sky, and stars were beginning to emerge, the same stars that had witnessed her arrival 3 years ago, lost and frightened and certain she had no value. Above the kitchen doorway, Samuel had carved something into the wooden lintel last winter, letters carefully shaped and smoothed. Love, found here, 1880, the year she'd arrived. The year everything changed. Clara thought about the girl who'd climbed into a stranger's wagon with nothing but a canvas bag and wounded heart. That girl had believed her father's assessment of her worth. That girl had thought she was too broken to ever be whole. But that girl had been wrong. She'd had strength she didn't know about, courage she hadn't recognized, and a capacity for love that had just been waiting for the right people to bloom for. She hadn't needed fixing, she'd needed space to grow, soil to root in, and people who saw her clearly enough to appreciate what she actually was, instead of mourning what she wasn't. "What are you thinking now?" Samuel asked, his voice soft in the darkness. Clara looked at her husband, this scarred, beautiful man who'd seen worth in her when the world saw waste. She thought about her sons, all 6 of them, who called her Ma and meant it with their whole hearts. She thought about the valley children who were learning because she refused to believe education was only for the privileged. She thought about Margaret Walsh, getting a second chance because Clara remembered what it felt like to need one. "I'm thinking about worth," Clara said finally. "How it's not something anyone can give you or take away. How my father tried to convince me I had none, and for too long I believed him. But worth isn't in how others value you, it's in how you value yourself, what you build, who you choose to become." She squeezed Samuel's hand, feeling the ring on her finger, the symbol of promises kept and love earned. "I was sold for 2 months of whiskey and wagon repairs. By any measure that should have destroyed me. But instead, it brought me here to this ranch, this family, this life. My father thought he was throwing me away. Instead, he gave me the chance to prove I was gold all along." Samuel pulled her close, and they stood together in the kitchen, where so much of their life had unfolded: first meals, first lessons, first kisses, first steps of babies, last conversations before sleep. The heart of their home, where the impossible had become real. Outside, the valley settled into night. Inside, their children slept safely. The ranch they'd built together stood solid and prosperous. Clara Kane, once Clara Whitmore, once a daughter who'd been told she'd never be loved, stood in her husband's embrace and knew with absolute certainty that she'd been wrong to ever believe the cruel words. She was loved fiercely and completely. She was valued beyond measure. She was exactly where she was meant to be. And tomorrow, she'd wake up and continue living the life that was, against all odds and all cruelty, beautifully and perfectly hers, a life built not on what others said she was worth, but on what she'd proven through her own strength, courage, and unbreakable spirit. The lonely rancher had called her his treasure. But the truth was simpler and more profound. She'd been treasure all along. She just needed the right light to finally see it. Up next, You've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.